They're going to point at me, they're going to point at my name. It's like, well, he's different. That's the best you got? You can't actually talk about what you want to do? My name is not raising your gas prices. My name is not taking us to war. My name is not the reason you can't afford your groceries. You know what it is? Their BS policies. The campaign that Mike Rogers and Donald Trump and their GOP MAGA allies are launching is already more bitter. All you got to do is look at the ads you're already watching on TV, started today. You know, they think that you want to use my whole name against me. Mike, listen, man, if you can't say the name, it's Abdurrahman, keep the name out your damn mouth.
So it looks like there is some momentum toward a deal between the U.S. and Iran that would end the hostilities. There has been very little activity on the part of the U.S. military against Iran in the last few days. There have been some airstrikes by the Iranians targeting sites in Kuwait or Bahrain. They've been basically showing the Americans what they showed last week when they hit the target in Jordan, that they don't really care anymore whether the Americans are fighting or not. They don't consider it a ceasefire just because the Americans say it is. And that is really an Iranian attempt to not succumb to or acquiesce to the Trump administration's market manipulations, because the Trump administration is trying to have its cake and eat it too, continue its attacks on Iran while not acknowledging to global markets that the Strait of Hormuz is closed and that this war is ongoing and that the region is destabilized, because that hurts markets. And Iran is not buying that anymore. It's a really high-risk strategy on the part of Iran to keep hitting the U.S. and hitting U.S. targets even when the Americans aren't hitting. I'm Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. I'm also on Apple Podcasts, on YouTube, on Spotify. So before I get to Iran, I just wanted to talk about the results in the Michigan Democratic primary. Abdul al-Sayed, he won. And this is a really important victory. Other progressive candidates also won in Michigan, upsetting an incumbent. There was a three-way race in which a progressive DSA endorsed, or I forget if he is a DSA, Democratic Socialists of America candidate, beat two moderates in which the establishment vote was split. And there was other elections. Apparently, it was just a total clean sweep for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And I think that should send a message to the Democratic Party consultant class, the leadership, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, Kristen Gillibrand, these basically has-beens, these people who brought us Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, who delivered two elections to Donald Trump and basically betrayed the base, these very pro-Israel, pro-establishment, still living in the 1990s leadership of the Democratic Party that is essentially, the voters have moved on past them. And this definitely delivers a message to them. But I think there's another really discouraging message that came out of this election. And that was in the margin of victory that Abdul al-Sayed got against the Congresswoman Haley Stevens. Yes, he did win, but he won by just a few couple 20,000 votes or something like that, a very small margin. And I'll put up a graphic here so that you can see the exact number. I don't recall the exact number, but it was, I think, even less than 1% victory. And this is despite the fact that Haley Stevens is, as I discussed in the last episode of the podcast, kind of a freak and kind of a terrible candidate and really just a weirdo in many ways, who has this fake Midwestern accent that she turns on and off when convenient, just so clearly like an ungenuine person, never really directly answers questions, has Israel coming to her in her dreams.
And in the United States Congress, I will continue to fight for the people of Israel. I will continue to fight for Israel's existence. Israel comes to me in my dreams. I see Israel's future, and I know that Israel will continue to exist for the Jewish people.
Just this surreal, bizarre loser. And despite that, the Democratic Party establishment supported her. And key was the $60-something million that AIPAC spent on her. And she outperformed the polls and she outperformed the prediction markets. This was a very close race. So I think that this shows the Israel lobby, this shows AIPAC that, wow, maybe if we had just spent a little bit more, we could have won this election. And I think that's the discouraging part. Al-Sayed overcame the odds and won this election in Michigan, a very purple state. He's an Arab American with a funny name, and he's a Muslim. He's going to be the perhaps the first, if he wins in November against the Republican Mike Rogers, he'll be the first Muslim to ever enter the U.S. Senate. I don't want to take away from his achievements, but I just want to issue this warning about the election result, what message it gives to AIPAC and Israel and the Paul Singers and the various billionaire class, Bill Ackmans of the world who bankroll this kind of establishment worldview, who finance the candidates and so on, is that we should have just spent more. And I think that that is going to be the takeaway from this election. And it's going to be just such an ugly next few months as these midterms approach, because you're going to have just more Islamophobia, more accusations that the candidates running on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party are pro-Hamas, they're terrorists, because they don't appreciate and don't support the war against Iran. They are pro-Mullah, pro-regime. You're going to have a lot of ugly rhetoric. You're going to have a lot of attack ads. You're going to have a lot of Facebook and clandestine operations targeting boomers, targeting those susceptible, targeting those a little bit older who don't have the wisdom and the filters and bullshit detectors that many younger voters and people who are more tech savvy and media savvy have. They're going to have like Abdul posing with Osama bin Laden. Is this who you really want in the U.S. Senate? They're going to really go all out, because what this election proved is that money does make a difference. Massive amounts of money do make a difference. And I think that the Thomas Massie primary in Kentucky, AIPAC managed to spend millions and millions of dollars to get Thomas Massie defeated in Kentucky. That was also the same lesson. And I think that's going to be something to watch. And later on in this episode, I have a brief interview that I did with NewsX World, India's NewsX World. Yes, this election is so interesting and so closely watched that even people and countries around the world are watching this election. A little primary in Michigan and the outcome of the midterms coming up is so consequential for the world that people are even watching what's happening in a state like Michigan in a country like India. And I have an interview in which I discuss just very briefly the primary from yesterday as the primary was going on. So on Iran, I think this is just a repeat of what we've seen before, with one big caveat. These reports, these leaks from the U.S. military to various news outlets, including Reuters and others, that the U.S. is really depleting its missile stockpile, and it does not have enough to keep this war going. And I think that that's a significant development. Not just the fact that the stockpiles have been depleted, because everyone knows that. Everyone who has heard of CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, these think tanks, everyone who knows what RAND Corporation is, or for the Center for Naval Analysis, all these government-affiliated think tanks that provide papers and white papers for the public to read, and they're on their websites. If you're reading this stuff, as the Iranians surely are, you know that the American offensive missile capacity and its defensive interceptor and defensive missile capacity are being diminished. And these warnings preceded the Iran war, by the way. They were caused largely by the depletion from Ukraine and the sales of these weapons that are very expensive, rather hard to make, take a lot of lead time and so on, like a couple years to get an order of these things through, require a lot of retrofitting of military manufacturing capacity. You got to get like companies like Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, that's what we're talking about, General Dynamics. You have to issue a bid and have a request for proposals, and then you have to go through these processes, and then the company has to get a team assembled and have a project in place to get these things done. Is not such a simple thing as getting online and ordering them from Temu. That's the advantage that the Iranians have because their drones, for example. I saw a website that in which you could order the frames, the shells for the Shahid drones or something similar to them on the website, and they're mass manufacturing them in China for various uses. The Taliban is making its own version of the Shahid drone, as has been noted on this podcast and in other fora as well. The fact that the U.S. military stockpile is depleted is significant and forcing the Americans to draw down the war a little bit. They apparently don't have the ability to continue a war using these kinds of luxury weapons that they've been using that don't require U.S. fighter jets to fly over Tehran, that could be launched accurately from a long distance, that you don't have to have bombers flying over Iranian airspace and risk pilots' lives. You can do what some pundits are calling like a luxury war, where you sit back and just launch these precision missiles, these satellite-guided, GPS-guided missiles that land on their targets, whether those targets are schools or nuclear reactors. You can do that from the comfort of being in a battleship or a trailer thousands of miles away, thousands of kilometers away. And they don't have that ability anymore. And they also don't have the ability to defend their own targets from an inevitable Iranian counterstrike. And I think that that is another consideration. The Iranians have increasingly been effective in their targeting. For example, the soldiers that were struck and 3 soldiers killed in Jordan in the last round of major attacks between the two countries, that was a shocker for the Americans, and that sort of woke them up to the insufficiency of their defenses at this point. Even at a relatively longer distance, Jordan is a couple countries over from the Iranian mainland. And there's also these worries, as has been reported throughout the media, that either the Iranians or the Iraqi militias will target Saudi energy facilities. And that is a very much easier target to hit. The Iraqis can hit them with drones. There is basically nothing but desert between the Iraqi population centers and the Saudi oil facilities, including that crucial pipeline, the Yanbu pipeline that leads from the East Coast oil wells on the Persian Gulf of Saudi Arabia to the western part of Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea and the Yanbu terminal, where 5 to 7 million barrels of oil per day have been getting out through the Red Sea. And there's also the issue of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That has also been a target from the Houthis, the Yemeni Houthis. That has also complicated the American calculations. That has complicated the fluffing up of energy markets and the salvation of the global economy. And then, of course, there was that incident when a drone of mysterious origin hit U.S. tankers moored off the coast of Egypt near the Suez Canal. And that was also, I think, a message from the Iranians, even though the Iranians were like, we don't know anything about it. It was probably the Iranians who did that, because if it was a false flag, they wouldn't just do some mild attack that was kind of a messaging exercise. There would have been a more robust attack that would have left casualties and prompted anger in the United States. The United States downplayed that incident and did not play it up and did not take advantage of that incident to launch further escalation. Given all of these circumstances and given all of the challenges that Iran poses to the U.S. and given the depletion of the weapons, it looks very much like the U.S. is being driven to buckling again, essentially, to the Iranian demands, at least for now. We'll see if this is more durable than the last time there was a memorandum of understanding and this deal that fell apart. And what it looks like is what I had predicted before, that the Iranians would have de facto control over which ships enter the Strait of Hormuz through the northern channel that goes through Iranian territorial waters, while the ships that exit the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf would exit through the Omani channel. And then there would be some kind of fee structure. There's some talk of that. And it does appear that the Americans are going to acquiesce to that, at least temporarily, at least until they refuel their stocks and so on. But there's a big chance that that will fail. But I think that the objective reality, the facts on the ground, will eventually compel the Americans to just give in to that. Because I hope, for the sake of the Americans, that the message has gotten through that there is really no military solution to the issue of the Strait of Hormuz. That is what a lot of people have been saying for months now, but it's become more and more obvious that the Iranians just have more resilience than the Americans do, and especially than the global economy. The question is going to be whether Iran will, at this point, simply open the Strait of Hormuz, even with the fee, unless the Americans provide some kind of sanctions relief. There is talk of some sanctions relief impending. There's reports out there that the Americans are talking about removing some sanctions, or the return of frozen Iranian funds. That would be a big signal to the Iranians that the Americans mean business, that they are going to abide by the peace deal, or at least give Iran something in exchange for opening the Strait of Hormuz. Overall, though, the fact that the U.S. is being forced into a deal, the fact that objective facts on the ground are compelling the U.S. to accede to some kind of diplomatic solution, it really gives yet another black eye to the war hawks, to the neocons, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, the United Against the Nuclear Iran. These people have been arguing for this war for decades. They've been demanding this war, and they've been advocating for this war for a very long time. They've been trying to use the tool of sanctions to preclude any kind of diplomatic solution to the problems between the United States and Iran. And what this war proves, and what the depletion of these weapons show, is that they were wrong. I've said this before, but the Americans launched 13,000 airstrikes on Iran. They gave it their best shot. And not only that, Israel joined in the fun. And to some extent, United Arab Emirates also was involved in more attacks than we know of. And despite that, the Iranian regime survived, and in some ways is probably stronger than it was before the conflict. Definitely, it's stronger than it was on February 27th, just after those massive protests and the horror and violence of those protests in January. It's definitely stronger now than it was then. The country is mobilized. And so I just want to say that to the people who were the warmongers, you fucked up, you failed, and your life's work is gone. I mean, your life work is shit. You spent like 25 years, 26 years advocating for this war, and you've got nothing. You got the war that you wanted, and it was a total failure. Maybe you should go to a fucking mountain or something. Go climb on a mountain. Go find some hobby, fly kites or something. Like, think about what a failure you've been. Think about just what a wrong turn your life took, that you basically spent your last 25 years advocating for this war. You finally got the war, and it was a failure. Shouldn't that make you think twice about just your life decisions? I mean, like, what good are you to your children? What good are you to your family if your life mission is such a fucking failure? If I was that big of a failure, I was that big of a fuck up, I would contemplate what I've done with my life, and I would try to rethink things a little bit. Even me, I was a foreign correspondent for 20 years, and I got laid off from the Independent. I couldn't find another gig that I liked as much. And it caused me to think and rethink my strategies and look at my life and what decisions I made. It was wrong for me to go into media. Maybe I should have gone into another line of work or something like that. And I spent a couple of years kind of ruminating about that and thinking about that. But you people are just you're the most unintrospective scum, really, is what you are, that I have ever encountered, because you're just one note on and on and on, despite the fact that you've been such failures, and you just keep banging away at the same note on the same instrument. Wow, you're just cheap and shallow and dumb, really. And I hope that you live your lives in misery, because, unlike, for example, let's say Robert Kagan, who was a neocon and had this extraordinary revelations after Iraq and has rethought stuff, and that is an intellectual, that is a thoughtful person. You're just a fucking paid shill, really. And I really wish the worst for you. If you're not able to learn from this experience, if you're just an automaton, someone drops a quarter in your ass and you spew something out of your mouth, is essentially what you are. So anyway, with that, I just wanted to play this brief interview I had with India's NewsX World about the elections, the primary in Michigan.
Now we are seeing this primary for the Democratic Party heat up in Michigan. Two candidates set to take the stage, Abdul al-Sayed and Haley Stevens, both with very different policies in respect to U.S. foreign policy with Israel. Now, how are you reading the polls at this moment? Who do you think could take the lead, given the demographics of Michigan, the fact that it is a battleground state heading into these midterm elections, and the importance of the Senate seat in the state?
According to the predictions markets and to the latest polling, Abdul al-Sayed is very much in the lead. All the energy also is on the left progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They're the ones going around in neighborhoods, putting up signs, knocking on doors. They're the ones who have very outspoken and vocal rallies and public events and so on. Haley Stevens' campaign is much more like a TV campaign. And some critics have noted that there's very little in terms of an actual campaign. There's just a lot of money being spent on her behalf. 11-1, 11 times more money is being spent on the Haley Stevens campaign as on the Abdul al-Sayed campaign. And yet, both, as I said, the predictions market and the polls are giving Abdul Sayed a kind of a blowout, actually. We'll see how that turns out. Another really interesting thing is that the election could already have been decided because record numbers of people in this primary election voted before Election Day, either through mail-in balloting or at in-person voting, but before Election Day. So it could just be that this is just the icing on the cake, so to speak, and that the election has already been decided in early voting.
Bozu, how do you think the matchup will look like for Michigan if indeed the polls are correct and Abdul al-Sayed is able to win this primary? How will he match up against the Republican candidates?
That's a very good question, because the general election is very different in general than the primaries. The primaries are very low turnout. A lot of party activists, a lot of diehards take part in the primaries, whereas the general election brings out a more diverse group of people, a more moderate and centrist group of people. But I think that Abdul al-Sayed, even in the polls, in the hypothetical matchups between Abdul al-Sayed versus Mike Rogers versus Haley Stevens and Mike Rogers, he still comes out a little bit ahead. Not that much. It's like almost within the margin of error, but he does seem to perform in those hypothetical polls a little better than Haley Stevens. And again, this is a midterm election coming up in November. It's not a general election. And generally, those are more low turnout in the United States, those midterms. And so that crucial aspect of the ground game, the activists, the enthusiasm, the young people that, for example, drove Zohran Mamdani to the mayoralty in New York and drove other leftist progressive candidates to victories in primaries around the country. That will be a crucial factor, and that will give him a bit of an advantage. On the other side, I know Michigan pretty well. It is definitely a kind of centrist state, and the idea of a Muslim, left-leaning Arab person being elected might be anathema to some of the more old-fashioned folks who live in Michigan.
Hey, thank you so much for listening or watching. This is Badlands. You can find me at Borzou, BORZOU.substack.com. I'm also on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify and YouTube.